Zandira lived in a small, isolated village nestled deep within dense forests. The village was a place where tradition ruled, where everyone knew each other, and the past was never far behind. It seemed peaceful on the outside, with its winding dirt paths and charming wooden cottages. The air always carried the scent of wildflowers, and the songs of birds echoed from the trees, creating a sense of calm. But beneath the beauty of this quiet world, there was a hidden tension, a darkness that had seeped into Zandira's life. Zandira was a bright and beautiful young girl, known for her warm smile and kind heart. She had inherited her mother's striking features and her father's gentle spirit, but her life had been anything but kind. Her mother had passed away when Zandira was just a baby, and after her father's death, Zandira was left to the care of her stepmother, Marussia. Marussia, though outwardly charming, was a cruel and scheming woman. From the moment Zandira's father passed away, Marussia had started to show her true nature. She treated Zandira not as a daughter but as a servant, using her for all the housework while spoiling her own daughter Eldaira. Zandira never knew peace. Marussia's harsh words were constant, and physical punishments were frequent. The woman seemed to take pleasure in seeing Zandira suffer, often for the smallest mistakes. And Eldaira, her stepsister, was no better. The girl would mock Zandira, calling her names and enjoying her discomfort. Despite the torment, Zandira tried to keep her spirits up. She was a kind-hearted soul, oblivious to the full extent of her stepmother's intentions. She believed, like many children do, that all the hurtful words and actions were part of life. She had never known anything else. She spent her days doing the chores, trying to keep out of Marussia's way. Every morning, as the sun rose and painted the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, Zandira would quietly slip from her bed, dreading the day ahead. It was always the same: constant work, constant fear, and constant manipulation. But beneath it all, Zandira had an inner hope, a quiet belief that things might one day get better. She held on to that hope, no matter how dim it seemed, because she had no other choice. Every night before falling asleep, she would look out her window at the stars and wonder what life would be like beyond the village, beyond Marussia's cruel grasp. Little did she know the day would come when everything would change and the truth of her stepmother's plans would be revealed, shaking the very foundation of her existence. Under Marussia's rule, Zandira's life became a relentless cycle of hardship. Each day was marked by toil, and each moment seemed to bring her closer to despair. Marussia was ruthless in her control over Zandira. She made sure the young girl was burdened with every household chore imaginable, from scrubbing the floors to gathering firewood from the thick forest. Zandira's days were spent doing the hard labor, while Marussia sat comfortably, often with a cup of tea, watching her every move with an expression that could only be described as cold satisfaction. Meanwhile, Marussia's own daughter, Eldaira, was treated as if she were royalty. Eldaira would lounge about, content to bask in her mother's favoritism. She never lifted a finger to help, and yet everything she desired was handed to her with ease. The contrast between the two girls was stark, and it only deepened Zandira's sense of helplessness. Eldaira would often smirk at Zandira's plight, making cruel remarks about how much more beautiful and deserving she was of her mother's attention. She would laugh as Zandira struggled to keep up with the never-ending chores, making sure to remind her that she was nothing more than a servant in the house. The cruelty of Eldaira and Marussia knew no bounds. Eldaira would mock Zandira's appearance, calling her plain and unworthy of attention, while Marussia would belittle her for any mistake, no matter how small. "You're a burden," Marussia would hiss as Zandira scrubbed the pots until her fingers were raw. "Do you think anyone would want a girl like you?" Zandira's spirit, though battered, remained unbroken. She found solace in the smallest things that the world outside her home offered. The birds' songs in the morning, the warmth of the sun as it peeked through the trees, the cool breeze that swept through the open windows. All of these little gifts from nature brought her a sense of peace, even if it was just for a moment. Zandira would often retreat into her thoughts, dreaming of a life where she was free from Marusha's cruelty. She imagined running away to a place where the air was filled with kindness instead of bitterness, where she could live without fear and be treated with respect. She knew deep down that this dream was just that, a dream. She had no means of escape. The village was isolated, and she was trapped within the walls of her stepmother's house. Yet, despite the overwhelming darkness of her reality, Zandira held on to that faint glimmer of hope. It was the only thing that kept her going, even as she endured each day with the weight of Marusha's cruelty on her shoulders. Zandira's resilience was her quiet rebellion, the one thing Marusha could not take from her. Even in the face of relentless abuse, Zandira kept dreaming, kept hoping, and above all, kept believing that there had to be something more to life than what she had known. The question that echoed in her heart every night as she lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, was whether there was truly any escape from the web her stepmother had spun around her. One evening, as the last light of day dipped below the horizon, a ragged figure appeared at the edge of the village. Kovio, as he would later be called, was a man of striking contrast to the peaceful world of the village. He was dishevelled, his clothes torn and stained from days of travel, and his body frail, as if disease had taken hold of him. His eyes, though tired, held a certain intensity, as if he was always looking over his shoulder, wary of something lurking in the shadows. The villagers watched him with suspicion as he approached. The air around him seemed to vibrate with unease, and many of the women whispered behind their hands, fearful of the stranger's presence. Some muttered that he was a thief or a fugitive on the run, while others speculated that he was cursed. Yet, despite their mistrust, Kovio was taken in by Marusha, who, after a brief conversation, invited him into her home. Marusha, with her sharp eyes and calculating mind, immediately saw an opportunity in the stranger. To the villagers, Kovio was nothing more than a beggar, but Marusha could see beyond his appearance. She had no sympathy for the man's suffering. Instead, she recognized the power his arrival could give her. In Kovio, she saw the perfect pawn to further her own cruel agenda. Marusha wasted no time in making plans. The thought of marrying Zandira off to a beggar was more than just a way to rid herself of the girl. It was a weapon. By marrying Zandira to a man of no wealth or status, Marusha would destroy the girl's future completely. She could then position Eldira to inherit everything: the house, the land, the wealth that Marusha had carefully built up over the years. She took Kovio aside one night and, with a sly smile, proposed the idea. "You are a man without a name or a fortune," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "But if you were to marry my stepdaughter, you would be doing us both a favour. She is of no use to me, but with a husband like you, she will be cast aside, and my own daughter will take her place." Kovio, tired and weary, only nodded in agreement. He did not fully understand the depths of Marusha's cruelty, but something told him he had no choice but to play along. The terms were simple. Marusha would provide food and shelter in exchange for his cooperation. Little did Kovio know, this was a game he was about to be drawn into, a game with much higher stakes than he could ever have imagined. For Zandira, the news was nothing short of a nightmare. She had been hoping for some small spark of kindness, some change in her life that would free her from the clutches of her cruel stepmother. But this was the worst fate imaginable. To be married to a beggar, to someone who had no standing or dignity. It was unthinkable. The very idea filled her with dread. She had never thought of marriage in this way. It was meant to be a union of love, of hope for the future. But Marusha's plan was far darker. Zandira was to be married off to a man she did not know, someone who seemed to have no future of his own. It was an insult, a further degradation of her life. She could see it clearly now. This would ruin her, and with it, any chance she had of ever escaping the miserable fate her stepmother had created for her. But Zandira knew she was powerless. Marusha's demands were clear. If Zandira refused, she would be thrown out, left to fend for herself in the cold, harsh world. No one would take her in, no one would care. The villagers had long seen her as a burden, and even if they had sympathy for her, they would not risk angering Marusha. Zandira tried to hold on to her hope, but it was slipping away fast. The life she had always known, the life of endless chores and cruelty, was now leading her down a path she could not escape. There was no way out, no way to stop what was happening. Her future had been stolen from her before she even had a chance to live it. As the day of the marriage approached, Zandira's fear grew. She couldn't imagine spending her life with Kovio, this stranger who seemed to carry the weight of some unseen burden. But in the silence of her room, as she lay awake at night, she realized that she had no choice. This was her fate, one she had no power to change. She could only hope, deep down, that somehow, some way, her life might still take a turn, though the chances seemed as slim as the stars in the dark sky above. Zandira's heart raced with desperation as the day of her forced marriage loomed closer. The thought of being trapped in a life with Kovio, a man she barely knew and could never love, suffocated her. She couldn't bear the idea of living out the rest of her days in this miserable existence. There had to be another way, another chance for escape. She had heard whispers of the outside world, of distant lands where people were free and happiness was more than a dream. But the walls of her stepmother's house seemed to close in on her from all sides. Zandira knew that if she stayed, her life would be lost forever. So she made a decision. She would escape. It was her only option. If she ran away, maybe, just maybe, she could find a new life, far from Marusia's cruel grasp. That night, while the house lay in quiet slumber, Zandira gathered the few belongings she could carry: a small bundle of clothes, a little money she had managed to save, and a piece of bread. She slipped out of her room, her heart pounding in her chest, and quietly made her way to the back door. The moonlight offered some guidance, casting long shadows on the ground. With each step, her resolve grew stronger, but her stepmother's watchful eyes had been waiting for this moment. Marusha had always known that Zandira would try to flee. The girl was too good, too kind to ever accept the marriage arranged for her. So when Zandira crept out into the night, Marusia was prepared. The moment Zandira stepped beyond the safety of the house, she heard a voice call out in the darkness, cold and menacing. "Where do you think you're going, little girl?" Zandira froze. Marusia emerged from the shadows, her eyes gleaming with fury. Without a word, she grabbed Zandira's arm and yanked her back toward the house. The fear that had been mounting in Zandira's chest burst open in a flood of panic. She struggled, but Marusha's grip was ironclad. "Let me go!" Zandira cried, but her stepmother's expression only hardened, a cruel smile twisting her lips. "You think you can escape me?" Marusha spat. "You are mine, and I will never let you go. Not now, not ever." Zandira's legs gave way beneath her as Marusha dragged her back through the garden, into the house, and straight to the small room in the back of the house where Zandira had been locked away countless times before. Without a second thought, Marusha slammed the door shut, trapping Zandira in darkness. "You think you can run from your fate?" she sneered from the other side. "You think anyone will care? No one loves you, Zandira. No one will ever love you. You're worthless. This marriage is the best thing that will ever happen to you." Zandira collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and despair. She had failed. The taste of freedom had been so close, and yet it was just as quickly taken from her. Days passed, but Zandira remained locked away, isolated from the world. The small room was nothing but a prison, its stone walls cold and unforgiving. No light, no sound. It was as if she had been erased from existence, and the days blurred together into one endless stretch of silence and loneliness. In her isolation, Marusia's cruel words echoed in her mind. "No one will ever love you. You are nothing. They pierced her heart each time, reminding her that she was worthless, that she was just a tool in Marusha's twisted game. She was nothing more than a pawn to be discarded once Eldira inherited everything. But no matter how much her stepmother tried to break her, Zandira clung to the small fragments of hope that still remained. She thought of the birds that sang in the mornings, of the cool breeze that had once soothed her, of the life that could still be hers if she could find a way out. Zandira's mind raced, her thoughts like 1,000 fluttering wings. She refused to accept this fate, refused to believe that there was no hope left. Each day in that dark room, as Marusha's cruelty continued, Zandira found her determination growing. She might be trapped now, but she knew she would not give up. There had to be a way to escape. There had to be a way to find the freedom she had always dreamed of. In the silence of her imprisonment, Zandira promised herself that one day she would make her escape. And when that day came, she would make sure Marusha's cruelty was repaid. She would never let her stepmother win. The day of the wedding arrived with a heavy, oppressive air. The village square, which was usually filled with laughter and bustling activity, was eerily quiet, as though the very earth itself sensed the injustice that was about to unfold. The small, private ceremony was to take place in the dilapidated cottage that Zandira had grown up in, the place where her life had been reduced to nothing more than servitude. Zandira stood at the altar, her heart heavy with sorrow. She wore tattered clothes that Marusha had ordered her to wear, a far cry from the elegant attire she had once dreamed of for such an occasion. Her hair was unkempt, and her face was pale from the days of isolation in the small room. Her shoulders slumped as she stared down at the dirt floor, too humiliated and broken to look anyone in the eye. She was not a bride. She was a prisoner, bound to a future she could never have imagined. Across from her stood Kovio, his face calm, almost detached, as he waited for the ceremony to proceed. The strange calmness in his demeanor unsettled Zandira. She had expected him to be just as destitute and defeated as she felt, yet there was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity that she had not anticipated. The way he stood tall, his posture confident, made him seem like a man of higher status, a far cry from the beggar she had been led to believe him to be. The ceremony dragged on, and Zandira's thoughts became a blur of hopelessness. Marussia stood nearby, watching with a satisfied grin, as if everything was falling into place just as she had planned. Zandira, barely able to hear the priest's words over the pounding of her own heart, wondered how long she could endure the charade before it consumed her entirely. She wanted to scream, to run, but she knew it was too late. As the priest's words faded into the background, a sudden shift in the air made Zandira pause. Kovio, who had remained silent throughout the ceremony, suddenly stepped forward, his voice breaking through the tension in the room. "This wedding," he began, his voice strong and clear, "was never what it seemed." Zandira's head snapped up in confusion, and the room fell silent, the priest's words caught in his throat. Marusha's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly masked it with a look of indifference. Kovio's gaze met Zandira's, and for the first time, she saw something more than the tired eyes of a beggar. There was a depth to him, a secret that he was finally revealing. "I am not the beggar you think I am," Kovio continued, his voice carrying an unmistakable weight. "I am not poor, nor am I a man without means. I am a wealthy merchant from a distant land, one who has travelled far to test the hearts of people like your stepmother." Zandira's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Kovio, searching for any sign of a lie, but there was none. The man before her was not the ragged wanderer she had been forced to marry. He was someone entirely different, someone with power, wealth, and most shockingly, the will to expose Marussia's cruelty. "I have been watching you, Zandira," Kovio said softly, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and resolve. "I've seen the way your stepmother has treated you. I've witnessed the pain she's caused you, the suffering she's imposed upon you. And I've watched her manipulate and control everything in this house for her own gain. Zandira's mind spun. She was unable to process the words, the shock too great. Kovio, the beggar, was not a beggar at all. He was a wealthy merchant, and worse yet, he had been watching her, knowing everything she had endured. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment she felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Could it be? Could someone actually see her suffering? Could someone care enough to stop Marusha's evil plans? Marusha, Kovio continued, his voice growing firm, your scheme has failed. I am not the man you thought I was, and I will not let you ruin this girl's life any longer. At that moment, something inside Zandira began to shift. The weight of her despair began to lighten, replaced by the faintest spark of hope. She could not fully comprehend what was happening, but one thing was clear. Kovio was offering her an out. He had seen the truth of her life, and he had made a choice to act. I offer you a chance, Zandira, Kovio said, turning toward her with a gentle but determined expression. You don't have to marry me. You don't have to live a life of misery and control. Come with me. You deserve a future far brighter than this. Zandira stared at Kovio, her heart beating in a frantic rhythm. She had never imagined such a moment, never thought someone would step forward to offer her freedom from the life she had been shackled to. But the possibility hung before her like a distant star, bright and beautiful. Marussia, who had been standing silently in the background, now stepped forward, her eyes burning with fury. You fool! She spat at Kovio. You think you can destroy everything I've worked for? This girl is mine. She belongs to me. But Kovio didn't flinch. He stood tall, unshaken by her venomous words. You have no power over her anymore, Marussia. You will be exposed for the vile woman you are. No more lies. No more cruelty. Zandira could hardly breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of what was unfolding. For the first time in years, she felt a surge of freedom, the possibility of escape. She had dreamed of this moment, but never believed it would come. Zandira, Kovio said softly, his eyes filled with empathy. Come with me. You deserve to be free. And for the first time in her life, Zandira smiled. Genuinely smiled. The shackles that had held her heart for so long began to loosen, and the path ahead seemed open, filled with light. She stepped forward, away from the life that had bound her, and toward a future that was finally hers to choose. As Zandira stood there, her heart racing and her mind reeling from the shock of Kovio's revelation, she struggled to process everything that had just transpired. The weight of the situation bore down on her with an intensity she had never known. Kovio was not the beggar he had appeared to be, but a wealthy and powerful merchant, one who had been observing her every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. She was no longer bound by the cruel plans of her stepmother, yet there was still something that felt out of reach, something that made her hesitate. Kovio, noticing the confusion and hesitation on Zandira's face, stepped forward, his gaze softening with understanding. I know this is hard to believe, he said gently, his voice sincere. You've been through so much, but I promise you this is not a trap. I am not here to deceive you, nor am I here to take advantage of you. My intentions are pure. Zandira looked at him, her heart still unsure, torn between the unexpected kindness he was offering and the years of pain she had endured. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe in this moment of hope, but doubts clouded her mind. How could she know for certain that he wasn't simply another trick, another person with their own hidden agenda? How many times had Marussia promised her something only to turn it into another cruel game? Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this for me? I don't understand. You barely know me. Kovio's eyes softened with a deep sadness, as though the question had cut him more than she realized. He took a deep breath, as though gathering the courage to reveal something long buried, something personal. "Zandira," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of his past. "I understand your confusion, but I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I was just like you, lost, betrayed, alone." Zandira's gaze never wavered as she listened intently, sensing that there was more to Kovio's story than he had let on. She was still struggling to reconcile the man before her with the beggar she had believed him to be. But there was something in his eyes that made her want to listen. "I was once in love," Kovio continued, his voice raw with emotion. "Her name was Isel. She was from a powerful family, the kind of family that commanded respect. I thought I had everything, a future, a life, a woman I loved. But Isel's family, they betrayed me. They made me out to be someone I wasn't, turning their backs on me when I needed them most." Zandira's heart ached as she listened to Kovio's words. She had never thought of him as anything other than the beggar, but now she saw the pain behind his eyes, the scars that ran deeper than the ones she could see. "They spread lies about me," Kovio went on, his fists clenching at his sides. "They ruined my name, my reputation. And because of them, Isel turned away from me. I lost everything, but instead of letting it destroy me, I made a choice. I decided to change. I reinvented myself, built my wealth and power, and I swore that I would never let anyone like Isel's family, people who prey on the weak and vulnerable, get away with their cruelty." Zandira's breath caught in her throat. She could see now why he had chosen to test her stepmother, why he had kept his true identity hidden. He was not just a wealthy merchant. He was someone who had been broken by betrayal and had sworn vengeance on those who would harm the innocent. "I've been watching Marussia for a long time, Zandira," Kovio continued. "She reminds me of the people who destroyed my life. She's cruel, manipulative, and selfish. I knew that if I could expose her, if I could show the world what kind of person she truly is, then maybe, just maybe, I could finally find some peace." Zandira felt a strange mixture of awe and empathy toward Kovio. She could understand the bitterness of betrayal. She had felt it too in her own way. Her stepmother's cruelty had been a constant presence in her life, suffocating her every chance at happiness. And now, here was this man, who had suffered a similar betrayal, offering her a chance to escape her hellish existence. But there was still that nagging doubt in the back of her mind. She had learned the hard way never to trust anyone easily. Kovio seemed to read the doubt in her eyes, and he stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I don't expect you to trust me right away, Zandira. I understand why you'd be skeptical. After everything you've been through, how could you not be? But please know that I'm not asking for your trust just because I want something from you. I'm offering you something real, an opportunity to live your life without fear, without cruelty, without being manipulated. I want to help you, to give you the life you deserve. No strings attached." Zandira swallowed hard, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She could feel the weight of his words, the sincerity in his gaze. For the first time in so long, a tiny flicker of hope began to take root in her heart. Was it possible? Could she really leave everything behind? Her stepmother, her pain, her fear, and start anew? But the fear of the unknown still lingered. She had been trapped for so long in the suffocating grip of Marusia's control that the thought of freedom seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. Could she really trust Kovio? Or would she be walking straight into another trap, this time of her own making? "I don't know if I can just leave everything behind," Zandira confessed, her voice trembling. "I've lived in this place my entire life. Everything I've known has been wrapped up in this house, in Marusia's world. I don't know what to do." Kovio nodded, understanding her hesitation. "It's not easy to leave behind everything you've ever known, but sometimes you have to take that first step into the unknown in order to find the life you were meant to live. No one should have to live in fear, Zandira. You don't have to be a prisoner anymore." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Zandira stood in silence, weighing her options. The life she had known had been one of misery, pain, and fear, but it had also been the only life she had ever known. The thought of change, of leaving everything behind, filled her with both hope and dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zandira met Kovio's gaze, her eyes filled with resolve. "I don't know what lies ahead, but I'll trust you. I'll take that step." A small but genuine smile spread across Kovio's face as he nodded. "You won't regret it, Zandira, I promise." And for the first time in years, Zandira believed him. After days of restless thinking and sleepless nights, Zandira finally made her choice. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders, but deep down, she knew it was the only path that could lead her to freedom. Her life, as she had known it, had been one of pain, fear, and subjugation. She could no longer live under the oppressive rule of Marussia. Zandira looked at Kovio, the man who had shown her a glimmer of hope in the darkness, and made her decision. "I will trust you," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "This is my chance. I can't stay here any longer. I won't be your prisoner, Marussia's puppet anymore." Kovio smiled, his expression soft yet resolute. "You won't regret this, Zandira. Together we will make sure she cannot harm you again." With that, they began to lay the groundwork for Marussia's downfall. Kovio, with his wealth and connections, had the means to expose Marussia for the cruel woman she truly was. Zandira, empowered by the knowledge that she had someone in her corner, began to see the possibilities of a life without fear, a life where she could finally make her own choices. They devised a plan that would unravel Marussia's control over Zandira. Kovio would use his influence in the village to gain support from those who had once turned a blind eye to Zandira's suffering. Together, they would gather the evidence of Marussia's cruelty, the lies she had told, the way she had manipulated Zandira's life for her own gain. Slowly but surely, they built a case against her, one that would expose her for the wicked, deceitful woman she truly was. But as Zandira and Kovio began to put their plan into motion, they were met with resistance from an unexpected source: Eldira. Zandira's stepsister, who had always looked down on her, now saw her sister's newfound hope as a threat to her own position in the family. Eldira was not about to lose her place as the favoured daughter, and the thought of Zandira rising above her filled her with jealousy and rage. Determined to maintain her status, Eldira began to interfere with their plan. She attempted to sow discord between Zandira and Kovio, planting seeds of doubt and mistrust. But Kovio, having lived a life of deception and manipulation, was more than prepared to outsmart Eldira. He saw through her petty schemes with ease and made sure that every attempt to sabotage their plan was swiftly thwarted. Eldira, realizing that her attempts to control the situation were failing, grew more desperate. She resorted to tricks, spreading rumors, trying to turn the villagers against Zandira. But the more she pushed, the more she exposed her own true nature, and the villagers began to see her for what she was: a spoiled, manipulative girl who would do anything to protect her own interests, even at the expense of others. Marussia, too, began to feel the pressure. As word of Kovio's wealth and influence spread, she began to panic. The facade she had carefully built over the years, the image of the powerful matriarch, was crumbling. She could no longer control Zandira, and she could sense that her grip on the village was slipping. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Marussia tried to manipulate the situation. She tried to play the victim, telling everyone that Kovio had bewitched Zandira and turned her against her own flesh and blood. She painted herself as the wronged woman, hoping to garner sympathy from the villagers. But this time, Zandira was not the naive girl she once was. With Kovio's support, Zandira stood tall and confronted her stepmother with the truth. "You've lied to everyone, Marussia," Zandira declared in front of the villagers, her voice steady and firm. "You've twisted the truth, used me, and hurt me for your own gain, but no more. The truth is coming out, and you will not escape it." The villagers, who had long suspected something was wrong, but had never had the courage to speak up, began to listen. As Zandira exposed Marusha's cruelty, the once feared matriarch's power evaporated. The lies, the abuse, the manipulation, it all came to light, and the villagers saw Marusha for the monster she truly was. Kovio, with his wealth and influence, ensured that Marusha would not be able to escape justice. The village turned its back on her, and she was forced to leave, stripped of everything she had once taken for granted. Eldaira, too, found herself isolated. Without her mother's protection, she was cast out, left to fend for herself, no longer the darling of the village. For the first time in her life, Zandira felt free. The chains that had bound her for so long were finally broken, and she could breathe, truly breathe, for the first time in years. With Kovio by her side, she was no longer a victim. She was a woman with a future, with the power to choose her own destiny. Zandira and Kovio, their bond now stronger than ever, left the village together, heading toward a new life. A life where they would no longer be bound by the past, where they could create their own future free from the shadows of cruelty and deceit. And as they walked away from the village that had once been her prison, Zandira glanced at Kovio, a smile of true happiness forming on her lips. She had made her choice, and it had led her to freedom, to a life full of possibilities. As Zandira and Kovio settled into their newfound freedom, it seemed as though everything had fallen into place. Marusha and Eldaira had been exposed, their cruelty and manipulation laid bare for all to see. The villagers, once blind to the truth, now rallied behind Zandira, offering their support and admiration. She was no longer the helpless girl under Marusha's thumb. She was a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for those who had suffered in silence. But just when it seemed as though Zandira's troubles were behind her, a final twist was about to unfold, one that would change everything. Kovio, who had been her quiet protector and confidant, had been keeping one last secret. It was a secret so profound, so shocking, that it would rewrite everything Zandira thought she knew about him. Marusha, who had been stripped of her power, thought she had regained some semblance of control. She was determined to fight back, to reclaim what she had lost. She believed that Zandira's victory over her had been a mere fluke, that the villagers' support would soon waver, and that she could rise once again. But Marusha was about to be blindsided by a revelation that would destroy her completely. Kovio had not been entirely honest about his origins. His true identity was far beyond that of a mere merchant. He was the exiled prince of a distant kingdom. The story of his transformation into Kovio, the beggar, had not been a simple one. He had been born into royalty, his mother a beloved queen, but his family had been torn apart by a bitter feud for the throne. His father's reign had been corrupted by greed and cruelty, and it was those very people, those who had plotted against his family, that had caused his mother's untimely death. Kovio had never wanted wealth or power. What he had sought for years was justice. He had returned to the village not to claim a fortune or title, but to expose the evil that had poisoned his world. People like Marusha, whose cruelty knew no bounds. The woman who had been tormenting Zandira, the woman who had tried to destroy her future, was no different from the heartless individuals who had murdered his mother. He had spent years in hiding, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment had come. Kovio's royal identity was revealed in a way that left Marusha and the entire village in stunned silence. His real name was Prince Kovalin, the rightful heir to a vast kingdom. He had kept his true identity hidden to protect himself from those who had once sought to kill him and his family, and to avoid any distractions from his true mission, seeking justice for the innocent. The news spread like wildfire through the village. People who had once seen Kovio as a beggar now learned that he was, in fact, royalty. His true status was undeniable, and it became clear that he had been biding his time, not out of greed, but out of a deep, unrelenting desire for vengeance against those who had wronged him, and those like Marusha who perpetuated such cruelty. Marusha, who had clung to the idea that she still had some control, was now utterly helpless. The royal connections that Kovio, or rather Prince Kovalin, had made over the years were powerful beyond measure. Kovio used his influence to have Marusha arrested for her crimes, everything from abuse and manipulation to fraud and theft. Her wealth, which she had stolen from Zandira and others, was seized, and her assets were frozen. The kingdom's law was swift and unforgiving when it came to matters of justice, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. As for Eldira, she too found herself abandoned. Without her mother's protection, and with her own cruel nature exposed, she was left destitute. The villagers, once afraid of her, now saw her for the spoiled, selfish girl she truly was. Her position had been entirely dependent on Marusha's manipulation, and without that, she had nothing. She, too, was cast aside, forced to live in the same misery she had once inflicted upon others. In the end, it was Zandira who emerged victorious, not only in her personal struggle, but in the battle for justice. With Marusha and Eldira stripped of everything, Zandira inherited the family fortune, including the estate that had once belonged to her father. But her newfound wealth was not the most important thing. What truly mattered was the legacy she had built. A legacy of strength, justice, and resilience. She had gone from being a girl oppressed by a cruel stepmother to a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. Kovio, now Prince Kovalin, stood by her side, not as a saviour, but as an equal. Together they ruled over the estate, and though their love had not been born from riches or power, it was one that would endure. They had both experienced betrayal, loss, and hardship, but they had also experienced the joy of overcoming it all. As Zandira stood in the grand hall of her family's estate, overlooking the land that she had once thought would be the source of her misery, she realized that her true inheritance was not the wealth she had received. It was the freedom, the strength, and the unwavering belief that no matter how cruel the world could be, justice would always find a way. And with that, the final twist was complete. Marusha's cruelty had led to her downfall, and Zandira's perseverance had led her to a life of peace, love, and justice, a life she had earned not through birthright, but through her own indomitable will. As time passed, Zandira embraced the life she had always dreamed of, the life she thought was impossible under her stepmother's cruel rule. She was no longer the frightened, subjugated girl she had once been. With the weight of Marusha's tyranny lifted, Zandira was free to shape her own destiny. The world felt open to her, filled with opportunities and possibilities that she had long been denied. Zandira chose to live her life on her own terms, devoting herself to helping those who had suffered, as she once had. She became a beacon of hope for the oppressed, a voice for those who had been silenced by cruelty and injustice. She reached out to the poor and the downtrodden, the abused and neglected, offering them kindness, support, and a chance at a new beginning. She built foundations for orphaned children, helped women who were trapped in abusive situations, and worked tirelessly to ensure that no one would have to endure the kind of pain she had experienced. Her actions quickly earned her the respect of the villagers. At first, many had seen Zandira as nothing more than Marusia's pawn, a victim too weak to fight back. But as they witnessed her transformation from a frightened girl to a powerful woman standing up for justice, their perception of her changed. They saw the true strength in her spirit, the resilience that had kept her going, even when the world seemed to be against her. Zandira's story became one of empowerment and hope, showing the villagers that even in the darkest of times, one could rise above adversity and make a difference. Kovio, now known as Prince Kovalin, continued to stand by her side. His wealth and power were now used not for personal gain, but to aid Zandira in her mission. He helped her establish schools for girls, medical clinics for the sick, and community centers where people could come together to seek help and support. Their shared vision of a world where justice and compassion triumphed over cruelty and greed formed the foundation of their partnership. But as they worked side by side, their relationship blossomed into something far deeper than mutual respect. In the quiet moments, away from the hustle and bustle of their work, Zandira and Kovio would share stories of their past, of the pain they had endured, and the dreams they now sought to make a reality. They had both suffered, but together they found healing. Their bond, born out of struggle and hardship, grew stronger each day. The respect they had for each other slowly evolved into something more, something tender and profound. Over time, Zandira realized that the love she had for Kovio was not born out of necessity, but out of admiration for the man he had become. Kovio, in turn, found in Zandira a partner whose strength and integrity matched his own. It was a love that was grounded in equality, trust, and mutual respect, and as they worked together to transform the village, their love story became a symbol of what was possible when two people shared the same vision for a better world. The village, too, began to change. The people who had once been complicit in Marusha's cruelty now saw the truth, and the air of oppression that had long hung over the community began to lift. Zandira's courage to expose Marusha's actions had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to stand up against injustice in their own lives. The villagers learned to value compassion over cruelty, unity over division, and honesty over deception. Zandira's name became synonymous with justice, and her work was a testament to the power of one person's determination to make a difference. As the seasons changed, so did the village. The once dilapidated homes were rebuilt, the fields that had been left to wither flourished, and the people, once fearful and downtrodden, began to thrive. Zandira's legacy was not just the wealth she had inherited, but the lives she had touched, the hearts she had healed, and the hope she had rekindled in a place that had known too much suffering. And through it all, Zandira and Kovio stood together. They knew that the path to true justice was not an easy one, but they were determined to walk it, hand in hand, no matter where it led. The story of Zandira's rise from despair to triumph became a tale told throughout the village, a reminder to all that even the most oppressed could find the strength to break free and build a better future.